Welcome back to Gardens of the Millennium. We're in Hampshire and Sussex, looking at how evidence of medieval England can still be found in today's landscape. This is the New Forest embroidery, which celebrates scenes of forest life. It was created by around 60 local people in 1979 to mark the 900th anniversary of the founding of the forest. It's on display in the New Forest Museum in Lyndhurst. While the New Forest still provides examples of how medieval people worked the land, finding evidence of original formal gardens is a lot more difficult. Barely any records of medieval gardens exist in this country, and it's only thanks to dedicated experts like Dr. Sylvia Landsberg that we now have some idea how they might have looked. With Queen Eleanor's garden in Winchester, named after Edward I's wife, Eleanor of Castile, Sylvia has designed an historically accurate 13th century garden. And why did you get involved with designing medieval gardens in the first place?
I had filled my garden with the contents of the local garden centre, and so had my two neighbours either side of me, and it was really getting rather depressing that we were all just coming home and rearranging garden centres. So I began reading about this period and seeing that there were all sorts of plants that we don't grow these days. I mean, even the corn marigold and the corn cockle and the beautiful old roses.
What would you say sort of typifies a medieval garden? How would you recognise one?
I think in comparison to the Elizabethan period, the Tudor period that followed, a lack of manipulation of plants, just letting plants grow the way they want to grow, observe them and admire them for their own form and their own beauty.
When you were researching into medieval gardens, were you surprised at how the medieval people maybe approached gardening?
I think the thing that has surprised me is how very visually orientated we are, always thinking in terms of colour, contrasts of colour, form, importance of architectural plants and so on, whereas they were very sensual and were much more geared towards scent, softness. They always talked about the softness even of vine foliage, which we wouldn't think.
So these were sort of herbs and things, aren't they?
Just different textures somehow that we wouldn't think about.
You've designed Queen Eleanor's garden next to the Great Hall in Winchester. How different would that have been than, say, a peasant's garden?
I think really the quality of the hard features, as they call them these days, the quality of the fountain, the quality of the trellis work using split oak lath. The old building accounts would give the different prices of these materials, so you get a feel for what would have been expensive, what would have been cheap. In that way you can pick out what would have been used in a royal garden in comparison to a country garden.
What about the actual plants?
Plants that were used medicinally were also used for beauty. There wasn't a strict subdivision between herb gardens and ornamental gardens that we have. Vines were used for shade. This was a very important part of a royal garden.
In early medieval gardens, the key flowering plants were of the present-day cottage garden type, unchanged through the centuries. These include red and white roses, purple irises, peonies and pot marigolds. Cultivation and plant use varied according to social status and access to plant species. As regards food and diet, wealthy households grew plants for distilling and for their enclosed gardens known as herbers. The average yeoman's garden would generally contain the more common pottage and salad plants and a few root vegetables. The majority of the medicinal plants and the shrubby aromatic herbs grown in medieval times differ little from what's grown today. Indeed, the medieval practice of treating illness with plant derivatives is becoming increasingly popular today. Though a body rub of nettles soaked in oil as a cold cure, for example, seems unlikely to make a comeback. Sylvia's medieval garden designs have also been used at the Weald and Downland open-air museum near Chichester. This reconstructed 13th century peasant homestead, called Hangleton, is in stark contrast to the elegance of Queen Eleanor's garden. So Bob, you're the main gardener here at the Weald and Downland Museum, aren't you?
That's right.
You're creating this medieval garden. I'll come and help you, actually.
Right, okay.
So how can you recreate a medieval garden when we don't really know exactly what they grew, do we?
Well, this is where Sylvia's research has come in handy, you see, because you don't really know a great deal at this social level and in this period of history, I'm afraid. So Sylvia's Landsberg research has been absolutely essential here.
And then a bit of guesswork as well. What have we got here
indeed.
then, Bob?
Well, we've got here, now these are very similar to a Welsh onion. We call them always useful onions. Now, their old nickname are fivers, because unless you split them up and put them into a group of 5 and replant them, then the witches are going to come into your garden. So,
oh dear. And
what
do
we'll have
naughty
to
things.
do, well, you never know what they're likely to
No.
do. We'll cut those off because those are always useful to eat. And what
They
we
smell
do,
gorgeous, actually.
they're nice, aren't they? You put a little hole like this, put a group of 5 in, tuck those roots in, put them in like that,
And is
and
there enough
away you
room
go.
for 5 onions to grow
Oh
there?
yes, well they are a bunching onion, you see.
Right.
So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
What am I going to do?
Let's
some?
cut that lot off, Ruth. And
And
then
then just in rows?
if you make a little hole somewhere about
Okay.
there, we can put this bunch of fivers in.
Now,
a little bit deeper
these
than
are
that.
sort of things they would have been eating as well, obviously. Sort of similar things to the things we have now?
Well, I'm afraid
Deeper,
not,
isn't it?
no. Diets, of course, were totally different. That'll be fine. They ate a lot of things that we regard as weeds now. Edible
Really?
weeds,
What sort
we
of
call
things?
them. Well, things like bristly ox tongue, shepherd's purse, mouseseed, chickweed, sow thistles, a whole range of things which really now are disregarded. But then, of course, were either medicinal herbs, culinary herbs, or just part of the diet, almost as we eat lettuces
And what's
today.
this we've got here you've already planted?
Well, that's borage, which is a herb, of course. In certain parts of the country, it was known as the herb of gladness, simply because it was said to do away with a melancholy mood.
Give me some more of that.
Now, if you bruise borage leaves, you get a nice cooling effect, and you put them over the forehead of people with a troubled mind. Now, when these come out, they're pretty little blue flowers.
Yeah.
So you put the borage leaf over the person with a troubled mind.
I'll take some of this for my director later on. Right.
Sprinkle these little blue flowers over the top, and it draws out a melancholy mood.
Now, in terms of how they gardened and planted, do you think there are things that we can learn from them today?
Or to a certain extent, yes, there are, undoubtedly. Because you see, they were, to coin a modern phrase, they were totally organic.
Right.
At this stage of history, very, very simple as well. Because the number of plants which have come in to this country over the last 600 years is quite phenomenal.
And would they have planted flowers in the garden just to make it look pretty, or was it all food?
Very unlikely, Ruth, extremely unlikely. If certain plants which were regarded as having a medicinal use or a colouring use, such as scarlet pimpernel, pot marigold, if they grew amongst the vegetables, all very well. Leave them where they are and use them, but certainly not just to make the garden look pretty.
It was just lucky that it had a pretty flower.
Yes, yes indeed, yes, but it would be used for other things, of course.
You've got another pot of things to put in your medieval garden here. What's in there?
Well, we've got wild oric here, or wild oric, and we've got collards.
Haven't heard of either of those, Bob.
No, well, I don't expect you have really, but this is one of the edible weeds.
You're going to put that in here now?
I'm going to
are
put
you?
this in now.
Right, it's an
So I'm
edible
going to put
weed.
this poor collard, which has just come out of the water, so it needs to go in fairly soon. Get it in there, This was eaten more or less like a lettuce, really. You just pick these leaves off and the tops and it goes on producing leaves. Very similarly to these collards. These are a type of cabbage in actual fact, but they're a non-hearting, non-sprouting cabbage, and all they do is go on producing leaves all the time. It's the nearest we can get at the moment to the type of brassicas which they had at that time.
So you need to get those in before
I'll
they
just
dry
get
out
those,
as well.
one or two of these in a little hole here. These will want watering in pretty well, really. And put another one in there. There we are. Nice little plants, actually. These will very quickly get away, you see.
So how appetising would the medieval diet have been, do you think?
It'd have been awful, to be quite honest. Some of the plants which would have to be eaten were just like eating cardboard, really. Some of them were bitter. There was no sugar about then, of course. So as far as our palates were concerned, they'd be dreadful.
So we're lucky we've got the supermarket to nip off to for lunch in a minute.
Absolutely, yes indeed.
Now on Gardens of the Millennium, this is the part of the programme where we like to appeal to your literary sensibilities with a little poetry or prose, relating of course to a subject we've been looking at in the programme. Now back in 1895, the timeless beauty and charm of the New Forest was perfectly described by J.A. Owen in his book Forest, Field and Fell.
The New Forest has a peculiar charm of its own, one that consists not so much in the grandeur of individual trees, but in the masses of wood, the long solemn aisles of trees, the groups of sombre yews contrasted with neighbouring whitethorn, the sylvan glades, purple-clad hills, and long stretches of heather and gorse. And here one finds oneself in company with Dame Nature in her best and most unspoiled aspects. All is still so little changed, if indeed changed at all, since the times when the wolf and the wild boar ranged here. Through their winding courses the same streams flow as of old, licking out deep pools by the gnarled roots of oak and beech, washing over shallows of rolled and rounded pebbles. The lily and iris there still gladdening the eye, milkwort waving blue heads, wood sorrel lifting its delicately veined cups, and wood anemones hanging their fair heads as they have done for centuries. You might travel far and wide and not find such another combination of all that is lovely and also grand in scenery.
Well, that's it for this time. In our next programme, we'll be looking at some spectacular monastic gardens and finding out how medieval herbal remedies are making a comeback. Hope you can join me then. Bye-bye.